Giants have been depicted in almost every culture on Earth, from the Norse Jotun to the Titans of Greek mythology. The archetype of the giant is ever present. Were there actual giants in those days? Greetings, mortals. I'm your host, Simon. Welcome back to the Library of Gnosis. The Nephilim were in the earth in those days, and also after that, when the sons of God came in unto the daughters of men, and they bore children to them. The same were the mighty men that were of old, the men of renown. Genesis 6:4. This is what Scripture tells us, but are there more references to giants in our ancient past? The Sumerian Kings List is an ancient stone tablet with, you guessed it, a list of kings. The list goes back 450,000 years in history. Here is an excerpt accounting the length of the reign of the first two kings. After kingship descended from heaven, the kingship was in Eridu. In Eridu, Alulim became king. He ruled for 28,800 years. Alalgar ruled for 36,000 years. Two kings, they ruled for 64,800 years. As you can see, these kings lived far beyond the lifespan of a mortal man, longer than cultures themselves even. But after the Great Flood, the reign of these rulers rapidly declined. After the flood had swept over and the kingship had descended from heaven, the kingship was in Kish. Another independent source confirming the veracity of the biblical flood story, by the way. These kings still reigned for hundreds of years. Kingship had slowly been turned over to humans, with demigods like Gilgamesh being the first, quote, human rulers, until it eventually passed down to mortal men. So, who is Gilgamesh? Well, his mother was Ninsun, a goddess, and his father, Lugandaba, the half-god king of Uruk. This would make Gilgamesh 2/3 god. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, he was said to be 11 cubits, or approximately 5.5 meters tall. Here he can be seen holding a small house cat. Oh, I meant to say a fully grown lion. Take notice of the mane. Only fully grown lions have manes. He was a giant born of the interbreeding between a goddess and a mortal man. A Nephilim, the offspring of a divine being and a mortal. He reigned for 126 years. A giant by the name of Gilgamesh is also mentioned in the apocryphal Book of Giants. Here we see the same parallel story being reflected in Scripture. This is just mythology, I can hear you say. There were no giants in those days. Well, dear listener. In 2003, Gilgamesh's tomb was found, as reported by BBC News. They mysteriously decided not to explore the tomb, stating that it was to prevent grave robbing, as many ancient artifacts are transported out of the country on the black market. You are free to make up your mind on that excuse yourself. If the king's grave were to be excavated, then our history books would be changed forever. Although the graves of many giants have been excavated throughout the world, if we look at the history of these excavations, we find one institution appearing a lot in these circumstances. The Smithsonian has a long history of hiding skeletons in their closets. So, maybe it's for the better that we don't excavate the king's tomb until we enter a more, how should I put it, enlightened age. Let us return to the Bible for a minute, as it provides us more information on the Nephilim. The Lord said to Moses, "Send men to spy out the land of Canaan, which I am giving to the Israelites." So they went up and spied out the land, and they told him, "Yet the people who live in the land are strong, and the towns are fortified and very large. And besides, we saw the descendants of Anak there." So they brought to the Israelites an unfavorable report of the land that they had spied out, saying, "The land that we have gone through as spies is a land that devours its inhabitants, and all the people that we saw in it are of great size. There we saw the Nephilim, and to ourselves we seemed like grasshoppers, and so we seemed to them." The descendants of Anak. Is that not a curious coincidence? Sounds an awful lot like another word we have heard before, Anunnaki. I would like to remind the audience that the word Anunnaki comes from the god Anu and the goddess Ki, so Anunnaki. But the supreme god Anu also goes by a shorter name, simply An. Are you beginning to see the connection? My Sumerian is a bit rusty, but Ak in Sumerian should mean of, so Anak would be An of, or of An. But this link between the Anunnaki and the Nephilim might just be a coincidence, since Anak is Hebrew. But what I am to present next is not. Anak is a homophone to a word for giant, and is a figure in the Hebrew Bible. His descendants are mentioned in the narratives concerning the conquest of Canaan by the Israelites. According to the book of Numbers, Anak was a forefather of the Anakim. The Bible describes them as very tall descendants of the Nephilim. The Anakim. An, like I explained, is another word for Anu, and Ki is in there too, just like Anunnaki. Now, as I explained before, these sons of God, or angels, were most likely what the Sumerians referred to as the Anunnaki. Go watch my video titled, "Are the Angels of the Bible Extraterrestrials?" for more information. I would also recommend my video titled, "Who are the Sumerian Gods? Anunnaki." Of course, if giants actually existed, then we would not only find their bones, but also their tools. Wow, have we? The Norimitsu Odachi is a huge sword from Japan. It is so large, in fact. It is said to have been wielded by a giant. Apart from the basic knowledge of having been forged in the 15th century AD, measuring almost 4 meters in length, and weighing in as much as 14.5 kilograms. Now, what makes this sword special is that it is battle-hardened. One would think one would not go through such a hard, expensive and arduous process for a simple decoration. Throughout history, we find many stories of man-eating giants. For instance, the Paiute natives have an oral tradition of stories of red-headed giants. The Si-Te-Ka, who were a red-haired band of cannibalistic giants. The Si-Te-Ka and the Paiutes were at war, and after a long struggle, a coalition of tribes trapped the remaining Si-Te-Ka in Lovelock Cave. When they refused to come out, the Indians piled brush before the cave mouth and set it aflame. The Si-Te-Ka were annihilated. The apocryphal book of Enoch describes a similar scenario. The first section of the book depicts the interaction of the fallen angels with mankind. Semyassas compels the other 199 angels to take human wives to, quote, beget us children. And Semyassa, who was their leader, said unto them, I fear ye will not indeed agree to do this deed, and I alone shall have to pay the penalty of a great sin. And they all answered him and said, Let us all swear an oath, and all bind ourselves by mutual imprecations not to abandon this plan, but to do this thing. Then swear they all together, and bound themselves by mutual imprecation upon it. And they were in all 200, who descended in the days of Jared on the summit of Mount Hermon. And they call it Mount Hermon, because they had sworn and bound themselves by mutual imprecation upon it. This results in the creation of the Nephilim, Genesis, or Anakim, Anak, giants, as they are described in the book. And they became pregnant, and they bare great giants, whose height was 300 ells, who consumed all acquisitions of men. And when men could no longer sustain them, the giants turned against them and devoured mankind. They began to sin against the birds and the beasts, and reptiles and fish, and to devour one another's flesh and drink the blood. These texts paint a dark picture of the Nephilim, but thankfully these are not all the ancients shared about these giants. In the story of Prometheus, one of the last surviving titans of the Titanomachy, the battle between the Titans and the Olympians, he is credited with the creation of humanity from clay, and defies the gods by stealing fire and giving it to humanity as civilization. Prometheus is known for his intelligence and as a champion of humankind, and is also seen as the author of the human arts and sciences generally. He is sometimes presented as the father of Deucalion, the hero of the flood story in Greek mythology. Also another independent reference to the biblical flood. I will stop pointing it out now. The gods and mortal humans had arranged a meeting at Mekone, where the matter of the division of sacrifice between gods and men was to be settled. Prometheus slew a large ox and divided it into 2 piles. In one pile he put all the meat and most of the fat, skillfully covering it with the ox's grotesque stomach, while in the other pile he dressed up the bones artfully with shining fat. Prometheus then invited Zeus to choose. Zeus chose the pile of bones. Hesiod describes Zeus as having seen through the trick, realizing that in purposely getting tricked, he would have an excuse to vent his anger on mortal humans. It may be, however, that in mainstream versions of the story, Zeus was actually deceived, and that Hesiod is trying to be pious by changing the story to make Zeus look better. As an act of revenge, Zeus hid fire from humankind, leaving them cold and shivering at night. Prometheus, however, out of pity, stole it for them shortly after, incurring the further wrath of Zeus. Prometheus' punishment was to be chained to a rock and have an eagle pick out his liver every day for eons, until Hercules slew the eagle, releasing Prometheus from his affliction. The Theogony text is ambiguous about whether Prometheus was freed or remained chained to the rock, but lines 1615 and 1616 are usually interpreted as indicating that he remained bound. Here the Titan or giant is depicted as being friendly towards humanity, a benevolent force. We were created in the God's image, perhaps they were as well, knowing good and evil, capable of choosing between light and dark. The Norse Jotun were giants, and the land they lived in is what my ancestors called Niflheim. Perhaps the word somehow shares a common origin with the word Nephilim, or perhaps this is also a coincidence, but I have been seeing a lot of those lately. The Jotun are sometimes described as clumsy and silly, sometimes evil and insidious, but sometimes also magical and wise. The giants were often hostile to gods and humans, but both groups also received help and advice from the giants, and several of the gods' mediators were giants. Although the Jotun and the Aesir were often at odds, they are actually related, as Odin, the Allfather, is actually part Jotun himself, as his mother, Bestla, was a frost giant. If you read through the Norse mythos, you find that the Jotun and the Aesir are basically cousins, and all the tales of war is basically just a family feud. The same is true with the Greek tales as well, as the father of Zeus, Kronos, was actually a Titan. Need I yet again reference the Sumerian tales? This has been my overview of the Nephilim, or giants. The references in ancient texts are near about endless, so if I missed something, or simply chose not to cover it, please do be forgiving in the comments. So, what do you think, dear listener? Did giants once walk the earth? Were there Nephilim in those days? Thank you for listening. See you next time, mortal.
Subscribe for more, give it a like if you enjoyed it, and feel free to share it. If you want to support my work, you can find me on Patreon at Library of Gnosis. You can find me on YouTube, Facebook, and Bitchute at Library of Gnosis. The audio versions of my broadcasts are available on Spotify as a podcast at Library of Gnosis. Music is produced by Coda from coded.music.